Well, the statement I made about going to uni being like kindergarten partly reflects on what it was like at Chiron. So I'll just briefly describe some of the things about that. And I think it was what I found one of the things I found so stimulating about Chiron, and that compared so favourably with what I then found at university, was that you operated the school like a university with a tutorial system. And that certainly hadn't been the case in my local high school, where you weren't encouraged to discuss anything with the class or with the teacher. Coming to Chiron, relatively small groups, which of course is a big advantage, but it was more that they were set up as forums. They were run like tutorials, where you're discussing quite complex matters. You're doing the readings and then you're coming together and discussing the readings effectively. And that was particularly true in English, but was also true of all the other classes. And the other class, I remember that being very clearly the case, was in art, in terms of my comparison with what I'd experienced at my previous school. It was so stimulating, and you were encouraged to really think, and there was a lot of debate, and your ideas were really challenged about the assumptions you brought to class. You had to really work out whether that was just an assumption or whether it was based on something you were reading, and a lot of input from the teaching staff to help you develop your thinking. And it really encouraged, I found, a lot of out-of-class work. I'd always done what was required at school, but I found that I enjoyed studying and researching as well at Chiron. So when I went to university, it wasn't like that at all. There wasn't really any tutorials happening, and there wasn't class discussions, and it was just this sense of being told to go and read stuff, and you'd go to the university library and it would be the same books that clearly people, because they'd all the same underlinings that clearly people had done for years, and it felt so dusty and it didn't feel related to the life that you were living. This was the early 70s. It was a pretty exciting time in Australia, about to finally have a change of federal government, and there was a lot of cultural change, and what was happening at university felt completely disengaged from it. I'd done very badly in my school certificate, so I wasn't able to study modern history because I'd been living overseas and working, and done it by correspondence, done virtually nothing. So I wasn't allowed to do science or modern history because I'd failed both those subjects in my school certificate. And so I did try to catch up on that at university, the history and philosophy of science. It was just so boring, I can't tell you. It was completely uninteresting. It's dry and dusty and boring as possible, and it could be, I think some people now find it quite an exciting subject, some people. So I just thought, it was just so disappointing. It was like I'd gone to this great school and had these incredible experiences and had my thinking challenged and really pushed. And then university was just like going just this way, way back. And I have to admit too, I got lured away by, this is 1973 by then, by the Nimbin Festival. We had this person come on campus and say, played the Pied Piper and said, leave all this, come away with me. Later, when I went back to uni and found it much more challenging, it was more like Chiron. It was newly established. It was by a whole lot of sort of, like Chiron, academic staff that were too sort of new thinking to fit into the normal system, and they'd started up this first communications degree in Australia. It was at UTS, it was called New South Wales Institute of Technology then, and it was full of, like Chiron, it was full of sort of like-minded people, staff who were really challenging and felt completely connected into the here and now. And that was I think I went back to uni in 79, 80, 81, so many years later. And that was really worthwhile. Yeah, well, I was encouraged by Chiron, definitely. It gave me a lot of courage to pursue ideas. But I think I also got a lot of that from my family, which put so much emphasis on the non-material world, for want of a better way of putting it, that life was about ideas and creativity, and that the material world is really of no consequence. It was kind of like a secular religion in a way. Yeah. If I think back on now, I look back on it and think, I always think I grew up with no religion, but actually I had this other religion So we would never have used the term a spiritual life, but it was a life beyond just money and accumulating of objects. Well, I have accumulated a few. But then, so in my career, I suppose I was always just searching to do interesting things that I thought would contribute to progressing those ideas in society as a whole. That life could be really interesting and engaging, and in fact, in order to have a good life, you needed to be engaged and interested. And underneath that, for me too, I think I had a lifelong desire to, sounds weird to say it, but to never see fascism rear its ugly head. And that idea that simple solutions to complex problems are never going to work. So always trying to get people to think in a complex way and to give them the tools to think in a complex way. And that's certainly what the communications degree I did also really helped feed that. And likewise, when I worked for the ABC, that was the sort of motivator, I suppose, to do the research, to get my head around really complex things and then be able to broadcast them in a way that made them as accessible to people as possible and as engaging as possible. Whether that worked, I don't know, but that was sort of my motivation. When I first started in radio, actually I worked in public radio as a student. It was part of my degree. I did a lot of my actual assignments. This is how great the degree was. I could do them as radio documentaries instead of in written form. So I did quite a bit of that, and in history programs and all across the network. It was 2SER, and I did a lot of presenting, and then I was set up a collective, breakfast radio collective. We used to meet at our house here, where I still am, and we had a different team for every day, and our idea was to go behind the news and look at issues over a long period of time, not just as news stories. So we'd revisit issues, and we formed a lot of connections with unions and so on like that, and that's really what got me the job. The experience doing that's really why I got the job at Triple J. I was very lucky. Started off just doing Midnight to Dawns, and I love music, and I grew up in a household where none of us learnt music or played music, but we listened to really diverse music. My father collected world music, as it's now called, and my mother listened to classical music. The radio was always on. And so I started doing music programs, and when I actually got the job at Triple J, Midnight to Dawns just as a casual, and when I got the job I did do quite a lot of music or documentary making. So I presented music, and I didn't see the two as mutually exclusive, because I think music, in a way, it was wonderful because it's an abstract language, and it gives so much pleasure that it was great to do that sort of broadcasting and be involved with music, because it's not just about a sort of political agenda. It's very liberating in that sense. Yeah, so that was really exciting, and that then set me up for life. The combination of Chiron and that university degree. Well, I am a great supporter of public education. I really, really believe it's the most important thing. We have to have a really good public education system. And in terms of primary education, I think by and large my children got good educations. I think, to be honest, that I benefited from the fact that you could choose which school you sent your children to, because schools change all the time. It so depends on who's staffing, who the principal is. That just means so much. So I moved my son once in primary school, and it really benefited him, but still in the state system. I moved, and my daughter I didn't move, but I was able to send her to one of two schools, the one that at that time I thought was better, and most of the time it was good. But when it came to high schools, I do feel that the public system has been really downgraded, and that for a whole lot of complex reasons, it's not supporting students. It's not supporting that sort of intellectual inquiry. It's just not possible, partly because of it's the lowest common denominator in a sense, because so many people have been taken out of the system to either select schools or private schools, and then thinking that it makes it more equal, there are no strands, whatever, in the schools. So it's very hard for it to suit individual students, and mixed in with that are huge behavioural problems. It just weren't the case when I was at high school. I think teachers have a really, really hard time in the state system. And there's just not a culture of learning. That's the real thing. I remember one of my UTS lecturers called Australia the culture of boredom. And I do think that's the overriding culture in the education system. People don't expect to be inspired. At points in my children's high school years, in both their cases, I looked to send them to a private school. I wanted them to stay they were at a select high school. I was in a privileged position. My son had a choice between a performing arts high school and the local select high school, and he very much wanted to go to the performing arts high school. But when he dropped out of performing arts, there wasn't a lot there for him, and he was very disengaged. But I was not at all happy with the private school system either. There was not a school that I was looking for. The school that I was looking for was Chiron, and there was nothing like that. One of the reasons I liked Chiron, you could sort of call it private school light, in that because the fee structure, well, certainly when I was there, it wasn't very expensive, so it was a bit like going to TAFE. So you were with older people who wanted to be there, and as in a lot of the students were older, not the same age as me, and it was affordable for a lot of people. It wasn't an elite school, whereas all the schools just seemed to be about protecting their image and actually wanting to be elite. That was their raison d'etre, so that you could mix with the right sort of people and make your contacts for your future life in business. It really wasn't about open education and what I would call really in-depth education. Having said that, my son did complete his HSC in the public system, because no private school would have him anyway, and for a whole lot of reasons. And in fact, he did really well. And I ended up getting coaching at a coaching college that was a bit like Chiron, where he was in small groups. They would run like tutorials. The person running it I had known from when I grew up out in Sutherland Shire. He taught at Chinelli Boys High, and he was really, really good. And that helped him negotiate his way through the HSC, and he did very well. And with my daughter, we did, in fact, at her request, change her. Similarly, she dropped out of performing arts. She was at a performing arts high school. She dropped out. And again, there wasn't really enough to engage her at that school because it was so focused on performing arts. And for both of them, when they were doing performing arts, it was fantastic. And she definitely benefited, in her case, from the smaller classes and the fact that it was streamed and there were higher quality teachers, where they have such a privileged situation where they can afford all this support staff and the teachers are just concentrating on the students. Whereas at a public school, I remember a friend did a comparison once that one daughter was at Sydney Girls High, where they had effectively one support staff for the entire school. And at MLC, where her other daughter got a scholarship, they had something like 15. And that is the key difference. The teaching staff can just teach and focus on the kids. And plus, there's a lot, because of all that support staff, there's the head, the management side of the school can be supervising the teachers properly and making sure that they're teaching to the best of their ability, or if they need further extension courses or whatever. Whereas state schools are just so under they're just really fighting to just do the most basic stuff. So she did go to that school, and she did get good quality teaching. And she was really engaged with her subjects, and it was really good for her in that sense. Yeah. She did focus, but that's an age thing. My son did it anyway at Newtown. She probably would have anyway, really. Yeah. But I can't complain about the quality of teaching. But the school itself, hated it. I hated the whole, it was a Christian school. It was really, it had become much more conservative under a new principal. The previous principal had established quite a good culture of learning and a good culture of tolerance, but the new principal was very conservative, and some really bad things happened, and I just couldn't wait to get her out of there by the end. And it's not a school I would have chosen to send her to, but there was just no choice, and I was worried that she was literally sort of dropping out. That was an act of kind of emergency in a sense. teaching to the test is shown in England and in America to be a really detrimental thing to be doing to students all the way through school. And one of the top educators in the world from Harvard is a Chinese academic. I heard him on the radio while I was driving, so I can't tell you his name. But he was just talking the other day saying that all the top performing countries, in terms of test results, which I think he said were Hong Kong, Singapore, and I can't remember what the third one was, maybe even Finland actually, which has a very good education system, but I'm not sure about that. But he was saying that they're realising what's happening is that they're getting these great test results and students are working really hard to the test, but it's resulting in terrible students. They have no idea who they are, what they want to do, and they can't do anything. They can't function in society. They don't know what to. They just don't know what to do with themselves. And that's the point you're making about individuality. It's not that that's the only thing that matters, your individuality, but unless you have some access to knowing who you are and what your strengths are and so on, and that's been encouraged and allowed to sort of flourish, what are you going to make of your life? How are you going to contribute? Just sort of have a nervous breakdown, and be sitting in a room wondering why those great test results haven't resulted in a rich and meaningful life. And I think the teaching to the test here is absolutely diabolical and producing terrible results. And I totally value education. I do think it's the key, not to high wages, but to knowing how to lead a meaningful life. Knowing the value of research and analysis, essentially, and knowing what to do when you need to, and where to go, and how to do it, and how to stay engaged, and how to put something back into the society too. Which private schools, I don't necessarily think they teach that, although some say they do. Some do give lip service to that. Well, having taught first year university, and I taught cultural studies, which, I sent them off to do some pretty weird things, and the lectures were, more thought-provoking than anything else to get them to think. And I remember this one student coming up to me after their first sort of assignment, which was had to go out and actually do this stuff. And she said to me, I was thinking the whole way through every tutorial we've had so far, I think it was probably week 4 or something, first year, what am I doing this for? How's this going to get me a job? Exactly what you just said. And she said, and then I was whinging to this friend of mine who's a medical student, and he said, this is your first year of university. You're not even being assessed, because we just had pass and fail at that stage. The whole degree is to be pass and fail. At that stage, they just managed to keep it the first year so that you could have group exercises and so on, so they weren't all competing against each other. Very important. This is a chance for you to this might be the only chance in your whole life to experiment and to try things out, and don't worry about, whether you need it for your job. And she said it was such a eye-opener to her, and she became a great student. She then engaged in the class and contributed, and I thought, right, I'm going to give that talk. The very first time I encounter my first years, my very first class, I'm going to tell them, no assessment, your chance to play. You've just done the HSC where you just had to study. Just go for it, embrace it, do it, and you'll develop further down the track. There'll be things that might be more clearly related to getting a job, but just enjoy yourself. Learn to think, creative thinking. What do employers want? Creative people who can think creatively, problem solving, emotional intelligence, all those things. And you can only learn that through experience, through being allowed to take risks and encounter dangerous things and thoughts and challenges. Data collection and test. Probably, I don't know, is that the last 10 years that became the case? Because prior to that, certainly at primary school level, there was a lot of teaching by inquiry, where you conducted, you had tadpoles or grew things, and then it kind of grew out from that. And very important. And the more kind of innovative schools, the sort of smaller independent schools, might run their whole curriculum like that. So, I think Rudolf Steiner still does schools that you do Egypt, so every single class that's across it. Now, somewhere in there is a really good recipe for creative thinking. And I can't see why you couldn't borrow or maintain that aspect of the curriculum, because it's still sort of in there. But the pressure now to teach to the test is sort of taking all the oxygen out of it. There's no room for creativity because there's just this pressure on you all the time, especially when it's tied to funding, to produce these results. And it's counterintuitive. It doesn't... I can't see how that's going to produce good results because students just get disengaged. Apart from anything else, that's the argument too about Indigenous education. If you're not meeting the needs of the students on that kind of that level of who am I and what's my relationship to the world and what am I going to do, how am I going to find meaning in life, which becomes a really big part of adolescence and early adolescence, if you're not meeting that need, you're just disengaged. And then you get all the behavioural problems, and then you create a much more authoritarian society. I mean, I remember once in the primary school they got a new principal up here when my son was there. And they just palmed this new principal off on us who was about to retire, and he had a very authoritarian approach, unlike the previous principal who'd been great, a woman who moved to another school. And she's why I was attracted to the school. And suddenly the school changed. Within a few months the children were naughty, there were all these rules, there was corporal punishment. It just sort of like spiralled out of control, and the parents all had to get together and just petition and just harass the local head of education for this area to get rid of him, and retire him early. The school was just almost decimated. So I think those spirallings are already really serious problems within schools, and it's the disengagement. And people might argue, it's a class thing, and that it's very middle class to presume that people are going to value education. But I don't think it is. If students are engaged, they're engaged. I mean, they come into the system with the same potential, by and large. Well, when I finished Chiron, I did enrol at university, Sydney and New South Wales, and then I dropped out very, very quickly. The only two things I regret is that I didn't study French. The French teacher was great, and I didn't keep going with fine arts. But in every other respect, it was a really good thing to do. And I became a hippie and went to Nimbin, and then went and lived in a commune and had a whole year doing a whole lot of things. That was out past Mudgee at Gulgong, and I worked as a Jillaroo on a property in a rouseabout and shearing shed, and I really liked it. And it's full of real challenges as well, in all sorts of ways. Very conservative community, you think, the country, and then you watch them prod the cattle with their electric cattle prods to get the cows into the truck, and it's just really hideous, and you think, oh God, this isn't what I thought it would be like. And then I thought I'd actually set up a school, interestingly. So I just realised this, and must have been inspired by Chiron for sure, and I was going to set a school up for disadvantaged kids on the land that we had. So I went back to Sydney to do Teachers College with that aim in mind. And I did 0 to the end of infants, 0 to 8 training. And the Teachers College was actually a very good Teachers College. It was inspired by a lot of really progressive ideas in those days of education, and all the progressive ideas were from early childhood education. So it was very child-based, responding to their needs, being as creative as possible. It was still, the way they operated the course was a bit too authoritarian. There's some rather old-fashioned teachers, but there were some really great people as well. And we did children's literature and music and art. You had to do all those things to be able to teach children. So that was really interesting. But then my life sort of changed, and I couldn't get a job in the department in those days when I'd graduated. I was just a casual teacher, hopeless, because I didn't have any experience to draw on. And it wasn't till I then later on worked in radio I realised you just have a template every day and you fill in the bits. And you can still be really creative, but you have a template, which is how you had to do that in radio, especially daily radio. I did morning radio, and to have, your speaker at 10 and this and da-da-da, and it made it possible. I was reinventing the wheel every day, completely. I rewrote the whole world, So I couldn't do that. I wish they'd taught me that at Teachers College. So I stopped being a teacher. I was a childcare activist, that's right. I worked then to try and set up childcare and make it more available as a sort of part of my feminism. And I worked in a women's refuge. I set up the first childcare centre in a women's refuge in Australia, and that was Elsie Women's Refuge in Glebe. So I did related things, but not within the department. That was also extremely challenging and exhausting. That was the tyranny of structuralistness, working in that sort of collective, as it was then. Then I went back and did the communications degree. And that was because I knew people who were doing it. They were the year ahead, and it just sounded so fantastic. And by then I was a mature age student, so I could apply as a mature age student, and I got accepted. And that's how I discovered radio while I was doing that, and loved that. And got really involved in radio. Got the job at the ABC, where I worked in both Triple J, and then I worked in Radio National. And I also had quite a period of time working in the Northern Territory on Territory Radio. And I also worked at 702, so I worked all over the place, but mainly Triple J and Radio National. Triple J when I was younger, and then I sort of graduated to Radio National. And I was a talks producer, and also features producer and broadcaster as well. So probably 50-50 presenter and producing. So I made a lot of really quite big and complex radio features and documentaries as well, which I really loved. Film program, all sorts of things. And then really I was just burnt out, and after I took long service leave, and it took me the whole 6 months to just sort of get because I also had a child, and it was very hard working. It was a very full-on, very demanding job. They wouldn't ever let me go part-time. I fought very hard. I actually established the ability to go back from maternity leave as a part-time worker at the ABC, but not in time to benefit me. And I was also president of my son's childcare centre, which was a work-based childcare centre that the ABC staff unit set up. So throughout the time, some of the time he was there, most of it, I was the president of that management committee, non-profit childcare centre. And that was a really great experience as well. I'm really glad I did that. When I left the ABC, then I went back and decided to do more creative work, and I investigated this archive of work out in a public gallery, and that led to me becoming a curator, and then it led to me going back to university and using all the research I'd done out there on this archive to do a PhD. And I was able to use I got a redundancy from the ABC, so I was able to use that to kind of retrain. And then that led to, my PhD led to, I got a fellowship at University of Sydney. I did a lot of teaching all throughout that period in higher education. Did communications and media and cinema studies, and also worked in the business school at UTS teaching people who wanted to do arts management. And then I got the fellowship, spent a couple of years rewriting my book, but I found it very difficult to break into academia. Partly my age, it was very ageist by then. I was 45 and I was a very experienced teacher, and they wouldn't even look at my application really. And I'm not a very good application writer actually, to be honest. I get jobs because people know me and they tap me on the shoulder. It always happens like that. But in this one case, they employed someone for a job I'd applied for, and then they rang me up and said, actually, can you come back and teach all those courses anyway, because she can't do it. I said, oh, screw you. So I never taught, I never went back to it. And then I applied for some big research grants. Very bad time to be doing it. It was the year that John Howard put Paddy McGuinness and some other complete dirt brain, and they vetted all the applications, and mine was a really unusual one. I had 3 big corporate bodies funding that were going to be in as industry partners. It was a great project. Anyway, got knocked back. And so I thought, well, academia's probably not for me. And so since then I've worked as a writer and curator and researcher, and really I have a good life. I can't complain. But at a time when I was probably a little bit isolated, I got involved in local government. I've always been a community activist. And so, again, I got tapped on the shoulder and asked to stand for council for the Greens, which meant joining a political party. And I did that for 4 years. That just completely took over my life. And now I'm back doing, but again, I learned a lot. I mean, I know I contributed a lot, and I learned a lot about how things operate politically and managerially and infrastructure and budgeting, and it was invaluable. And so I can use all those skills. I'm now back being a community activist and organising the campaign against the proposed tollway system throughout Sydney, WestConnex. I'm not on my own. I'm one of a committee, and but that's huge, and it's going to be a long battle. But I've done it before. That's how I got involved in local politics. We stopped the M4 East, and we got the light rail, and I was directly involved in both those campaigns. And they were very, very good campaigns. So I'm hoping this one will be too. But it's a long haul. And I'm still writing and curating that's how I earn a living. But they're a bit mutually exclusive. It's actually quite hard to be a local activist and write, because writing's quite meditative, and so and curating and stuff like that. I'm working on a film project as well, so it's sometimes I wish I wasn't quite so multitasked. It's a bit hard, but I can't complain.